Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jamie Staten, and I'm the Family Engagement Specialist here at TRECA. And today for our family session, we have several different staff members from our special needs department that will be helping us navigate us through different topics. Before we begin, if you do not already have your microphone muted, you will want to mute it when you're not speaking. That way we don't get a bunch of static throughout the presentation. And then after each topic, we will be allowing some time for questions at the end. So you can ask a question, you can unmute your microphone, or you can ask the question in the chat box. Either is fine, whatever you're more comfortable with. We will be recording the meeting and posting it in Brightspace later for those that are unable to attend, or if you want to go back and watch it at a later date, that is fine as well. So we will go ahead. The three topics that we are covering today is supporting students with disabilities, the suspected disability process, and supporting students with sensory needs. And we will go ahead and get started with supporting students with disabilities. And Mrs. Simpkins is going to go ahead and lead us through that discussion.
All right. Good afternoon, parents. My name is Heather Simpkins, and I'm the Assistant Director for Special Education at TRECA. So today I just want to give you guys an overview on what exactly is an IEP, what is a 504, what are the differences, and what does special education look like at TRECA. So first, what exactly is an IEP? An IEP stands for an Individualized Education Program. An IEP is written for students who have qualified for special education by meeting all of the criteria, including the need for specially designed instruction. And you'll hear me talk about that, and I'm going to refer to that as SDI. And SDI is instruction that is different from instruction that other students receive. So we provide specially designed instruction through the student's IEP. An IEP consists of several sections. There is future planning, and that's just goals. What does the parent want for the student? What does the student want? What do the teachers want? Any special factors, the need for assistive technology. Does the student have communication needs? So there's a list of those questions. Do they need special physical education? The post-secondary transition services are for students that are age 14 and over, and that includes goals and objectives for students getting ready for them to transition outside of high school. That then includes annual goals, and those are simply goals for the student. We want them to do this by this time. An IEP is typically valid for 1 year. So what goals do we want to work with that student on between now and the end of the year? And the objectives are how are we going to get there? How are we going to help those students reach those goals? The next section is our SDI. This includes related services. Does the student get speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy? Oh, the slide moved, Jamie. Sorry, thanks. Transportation, which at TRECA, students are not driving to and from school, so we don't really have the need for transportation. Extracurricular activities, will the student participate in activities as non-disabled students will? And then we look at the student's placement. We always want to look at least restrictive environment, and I'm going to go into that more as I continue talking about this. I'll explain least restrictive environment. And then last, we look at state and district testing. Will the student take state test with accommodations? No accommodations? Do they need extended time? Do they need frequent breaks? Do they need one-on-one testing? What accommodations does that student need when they're taking those tests? And next slide. So there's also a thing we call a 504 plan. So a 504 plan provides supports and accommodations to students with a disability. The disability must impact at least one area of daily living, including education. A 504 plan does not include specially designed instruction, and it does not have annual goals. So a student qualifies for a 504 plan. They have a need for supports, they have a need for accommodations because of a medical factor, but they do not have a need for specially designed instruction. They can receive the same instruction that other students do. Next slide. So this is what I was, what do services look like at TRECA? So one of the first things I want to talk about is classroom placements. The law requires that we place students in the least restrictive environment possible while still allowing that student to make progress. A student on an IEP can start at the least restrictive, which would be the general education classroom with no supports. For example, if a student is on an IEP and they have a learning disability in reading, but they don't have a need or any disabilities in math, they could just be in their normal math room with no supports. And then we move up to the general education classroom with special ed supports. So the student is still in the general ed classroom. They're still receiving the education of non-disabled students, but we also have built-in supports and services to help that student. For example, we have intervention specialists that teach all of our academic areas, and they work with the student individually if they need to. They may put in supports, such as kind of some pre-teaching of vocabulary for just the special education students. The next is resource room classroom. So all of our resource room classrooms are taught by licensed intervention specialists. Those classes only have students that are in special education. They're still learning the content standards, but they're maybe learning it at a slower pace, and things may be broken down a little bit more than in the general education room. So the most restrictive environment that we have at TRECA is our Foundations program. So the Foundations program is based on extended standards. These are students with the most significant cognitive disabilities, and those students need extended standards. They need more of a living skills-based education. So those are kind of our continuum of services. A student may be in a resource room classroom for one class, and in, for example, a general education classroom with supports in another class. Next slide. So how do students receive specially designed instruction at TRECA? So they receive instruction in their classroom through specialized programs. And for example, we use Catch Up Math to help students with their math skills, and Reading Horizons as an example for reading. So these are programs that are available to students that are on an IEP and have a need for these programs. They also may have one-on-one meetings with their intervention specialist. At any time, if your student is struggling, you need to meet with your teacher. We ask that you reach out to the teacher. They will schedule a meeting with your student. So we can also do the one-on-one meetings. A lot of times we also do small groups with students, and that's especially true in elementary school. When students get to high school, I know they like more of that one-on-one versus meeting in a group with other students. We also have supplemental content embedded within the course. The general education students may have this, and the special education students, it may look a little bit different for them. They may have supplemental instruction. They may have something read aloud to them. So we do give them that supplemental contact right in the course. They also may have alternative assessments and assignments. Maybe a student in the general education would take like a typical assessment, and maybe a student that receives special education services would be able to take that same assessment orally, or they may have less questions, or they may have the questions read to them. So that was a very quick overview of what an IEP looks like and how we service IEPs at TRECA. Do any parents in the meeting have any questions for me about what I went over? Okay, and if you think of any questions, I know we're going to have time to ask at the end also. So now we'll move on to our second section, the suspected disability process.
Hi there, my name is Heather Weaver, and I am the Response to Intervention Coordinator at the school. And part of the responsibility in my position is to make sure that students within general education have the supports that they need to be successful. Once we see that those supports within general education are not sufficient for a student, I'm part of the team that is called the Suspected Disability Team, and that team's job is to identify students who may be eligible for special education services. So we call that at TRECA the Suspected Disability Process. Other schools might call it the Intervention Assistance Team or IAT process. Some schools just call it the IEP process. So it goes under a lot of names. At TRECA, though, we call it the Suspected Disability Process. Now, child find is the legal requirement that schools have to identify and evaluate children who are suspected of having a disability and who might be in need of special education or related services. And really, that entire process has three major components that you can see on the screen there. Now, each of those components is broken into a number of smaller components. But the first section there is what we refer to as suspected disability. So before the school is permitted to refer a student to our school psychologist for a special education evaluation, we have to be able to provide data that shows why we suspect the student might have a disability. So that's that portion of the process. Once that data has been collected, which honestly can come from a lot of different places. It can be academic data from the teachers. It can be past historical academic data from other schools if a student is coming with significant data that way. It could come from an outside evaluation that has been completed perhaps at a children's hospital. We see a lot of those. It also obviously will include any parent input, especially in our environment. That's super important for us to work closely with parents because they're the ones who are seeing the student work every day. So that information can come from a number of different places, but once we do have the data that indicates that there might be a disability for a student, then we move into the evaluation portion of the process. And that typically is done by our school psychologist, who determines what evaluation assessments are needed and then takes the reports from those. That ETR stands for Evaluation Team Report. So at the end of that process, there is a meeting where all the stakeholders will come together, look at all of the reports, and then determine whether or not that student is eligible for special education services. If the student is determined to be eligible, then we move into the IEP process, and that's another portion where we actually develop the plan that's going to travel with that student and determine what specially designed instruction is needed and how that's going to be presented, which Mrs. Simpkins already talked about. So if you could move on to the next slide. An IEP stands for individualized education plan. And really every step of this process is individualized for each student. These are the, I think it's 13 disability categories that the Ohio Department of Education recognizes. So obviously, if you're thinking about the suspected disability portion, that the initial portion of this process, a student who is visually impaired, the data that we would need to say we suspect a disability is going to be very different than the data that we would need in the second column, for example, for a specific learning disability, which would be perhaps in reading or in math. So there's not a cookie cutter way for us to say this is exactly what we need for all students. It's really individualized, and the time that it takes to collect that data might be very different. For example, if a parent feels like a student is struggling in reading or math, and that student has never worked with his teachers on a one-on-one basis in Google Meet, we might need to take a little bit of time for that student to receive some general education interventions, because for a specific learning disability suspicion, we have to have provided general education interventions and see that those are not sufficient for a student. So, there are a lot of different components that play into this. And if you could move to the next slide, I wanted to show you the timeline for each kind of section of this process. Just to give you an idea of how long it may take. Oftentimes it does not take this long to get through the entire process from the time a parent may request an evaluation or a teacher might request an evaluation for a student to the time that a student might end up with an IEP. But these are the timelines that are from the Ohio Department of Education that we abide by. So from the time that an evaluation would be requested to the time that we give our initial response, essentially saying, yes, we suspect that the student has a disability and we're going to make a referral, or we don't have data that indicates that the student might have a disability at this point, that initial response from us, which has to come in writing, and that's in the form of a prior written notice, that's what PWN stands for. So any parent who requests an evaluation will receive a form from the Ohio Department of Education that we complete. And we need to provide that to the parent within 30 days. It explains our decision, at least our initial decision, and then what our next steps are going to be. Oftentimes, especially, for example, with specific learning disability suspicions, in our environment, 30 days isn't quite enough time to get interventions ramped up and going to really say that we are able to make an educated decision at that point. So we might say our initial decision is to not evaluate at this time, but we're going to continue those interventions for a time to continue collecting the data. And then we may revisit, especially if the teachers feel that there are reasons for concern there. But anyway, that initial response from the school is going to happen within 30 days. If our decision is that we do suspect the student may have a disability and we go ahead and make a referral, from that referral to the time that all of the, we get permission from the parent to do the evaluations, the evaluation occurs, the reports are generated, and then that meeting is held to determine whether or not the student is eligible for special education. That's another 90 days on top of that initial 30 days. So, that's up to 3 months that all of those different things are happening. So a lot of times parents feel like, what's going on? This is taking forever. It can seem like that because it's not a quick process. There are lots of steps that take place to make sure that everything happens and that every child is getting exactly what they need. So I always like to let parents know that, it's not necessarily you can request it and we can test the next day or even the next week and move on. So it can take some time, which honestly as a parent can be very frustrating. And we certainly understand that. We try to make it happen faster than that if we absolutely can. Different times of the years, our ability to test students is, more limited. So we may go closer to that 90 days than at other times in the year. So it really depends. Once that meeting is held, the student is determined to be eligible, then we go ahead and, if you could jump back one more slide there, thanks. If we determine that the student is eligible, from that point, that's the ETR meeting, Then there's another 30 days that is provided to actually write that individual education plan for the student and to get it up and running. So if you put all of those together, that's up to a 5-month spread. Again, we try not to make it last that long because we don't like that, but at times, different times in the years, that is the possibility. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of all of the steps that take place to, from the time a parent might request an evaluation to, the possibility of actually getting that IEP in place for that child. Are there any initial questions? Again, we can always come back to questions at the end, but any questions about that process right now? Okay, well, we'll go ahead and move on. I'm going to pass this on to our next team who is going to present.
Okay, well, my name is Elizabeth Jeske, and I am the school psychologist here at TRECA that Mrs. Weaver was talking about. And I am going to start off our section about how to support students with sensory needs. I'm just going to introduce what a sensory need is and talk about some of those sensory issues that students could be having. And then I do have 2 others presenting with me that will go into some more detailed things about what might be able to be done at home or within academics and within their classes. And so when we're thinking about sensory needs, we need to start with what are our senses? So what does this actually mean? So that is the things that we hear, we smell, we taste, we touch, or that we see. So it is our 5 senses. And when we're trying to determine what a sensory need might be, we can think about if you hear a sudden, unexpected, loud noise, you're going to have some sort of reaction. You might jump, you might yell, you're going to have something happen, but you're probably going to be able to regulate yourself back down to normal within a matter of seconds. It's not going to take that long to be able to recover from hearing that noise. A student who has sensory needs or an individual with sensory needs may not be able to regulate themselves back down. They might hear that loud noise and it might take a few minutes. It could take a half hour. It could take even longer. They might have a tantrum. They might just become extremely frustrated. They might get physical. There's a lot of different reactions that they might be able to have because they can't regulate themselves back down. So if you can move to the next slide. Some of the things that we think about that could cause these sensory issues or concerns, some of the things might be environmental. So again, those loud noises, things that we're hearing, if there's music going on in the background or the TV's on, if there's lots of noises happening in the home, siblings running around, pets barking, all of those types of noises could be too much of an input into a student's sensory to be able to then focus on their schoolwork. And it might cause them, if there's too much happening, it could cause them to either shut down, again, throw that tantrum, or just not be able to access their schoolwork at that time. So seeing, after hearing, seeing is also something that we look at in the school setting, and that can be actual visual distractions of what is physically around them. So it can be if they have a cluttered work area, again, if there's movies that are happening, if there's some sort of visual input that is overstimulating them, and it can actually be in their curriculum occasionally, and we're going to talk about curriculum a little bit later if that's ever a problem. But the visual distractions and virtual distractions as well, or having that cluttered computer desktop, having too many windows or tabs open. If there's too much that is open or within what a student is able to see, they might become overwhelmed. And again, just not able to regulate, to focus on the one thing they need to be doing. And that can cause them to have some of those difficulties. So I am going to turn the meeting over then to Mrs. Herring so she can talk about our next portion for this.
My name is Mrs. Herring, or Hannah Herring. I'm an intervention specialist, and I work in the elementary with students who have special needs. And the next kind of portion of sensory needs is whenever we're thinking about physical supports. and ways that you might be able to help your child if they have physical needs. So one of the biggest things, and I think one of the most unique things that TRECA has to offer, is that you can take frequent breaks as often as possible or as often as needed. One thing that might be helpful whenever you're trying to set up breaks for your student is to use a timer to help set and monitor breaks. Those can also be great transitional cues for your students, so letting them know that they have a break coming up or that their break is almost over and it's almost time to get back to work. And there's kind of two main ways that you might think of a sensory break. Typically, there's input and then retreat. So input is whenever you're looking for a stimulus, some type of sensory seeking activity. And then a sensory retreat is basically a break. You might think of that as something like a more peaceful activity. So some input suggestions or just things, options might be for your student to have a break for some type of exercise. Maybe it's stretching, riding a bike, playing ball outside. Many students who have sensory needs really enjoy swinging because it kind of gives you that motion whenever you're swinging back and forth, or jumping around, just running around outside. All of those are sensory input opportunities. So that would be, all of those would be great breaks for your student. And then the opposite of that is sensory retreat. So this is whenever you're noticing that maybe your child is overstimulated and they're needing to have sort of like a timeout, more peaceful experience. So maybe that would be something like some breathing, yoga, that type of thing, going for a walk, taking a nap, maybe some calm music, or doing a quiet activity like putting a puzzle together. So those are just some physical supports and breaks that you may be able to offer to your child to help support their sensory needs. And I'm going to hand it over to Nancy. She's going to tell us a little bit about how you can help them out with academic supports.
Hi, I'm Nancy Kimmel. I am also an intervention specialist at the high school. I do the high school math. And so what we put together is, again, some proactive things that can be done to help your student with sensory needs. So now that Elizabeth talked about the environment, so the environment is conducive for learning and there are activities that you have planned for breaks, we just wanted to touch on some tips for staying organized. Being organized helps students with being proactive to avoid that sensory overload, feeling overwhelmed in classes, and even students that don't have sensory needs can get this way. Feeling that overwhelming feeling in classes or like there is too much going on can contribute to that sensory overload. So the first thing that we took a look at was just the curriculum setup, especially if you're newer to TRECA. It can take some time to learn how to navigate in the classroom and how to navigate the system in general. So taking that time with your student to really learn the ins and outs of their classes can be really, really helpful in that sensory overload, trying not to be in the sensory overload. And then also set up a learning routine and a schedule. This is very important. For many students, they want to knock out the required 5 hours and 12 minutes that they need to be on each day. I think this is especially true with the high school students, but the problem with this is that it does not allow time for breaks or meals or organizing their things between classes. So taking that time to set up that schedule so that they know exactly when they're going to be doing what is very helpful. The live classes in the elementary does kind of help set up that schedule, but at the high school level, we don't have typically those classes. It's more one-on-one sessions when needed. So having that schedule is a great way to stay organized. Something else that's very helpful is to have a separate notebook for each class to keep information in order so that a student knows exactly where they need to go for that class. This can be physical, or a lot of students are using virtual notebooks, which is great as well. Also create a checklist for daily assignments and activities. This helps with kind of reconciling what they are thinking versus what they are doing. And again, can help with that, eliminating that sensory overload. They have a physical sign of checking it off and that it's complete. They know they can move on to the next task and kind of mentally take that break to the next session. I think that we can, let me just move on. Oh, one more thing. On this slide, we see that there's this to-do list. This actually comes right from Google Docs. If you open up a Google, Google Sheets, I want to call it Excel, and that's a little dated. But if we open up a Google Sheets, this is actually one of the formats that you can have automatically. And it's a to-do list where you can write what you need to do each day or, each week. And if you click on the little done box, it actually crosses it out. So this is a very good visual way for a student to know they've completed a task and are able to move on. And if we could go up a slide, Jamie, thank you. Okay. And as Hannah was talking about taking a break and that list of potential things to do is wonderful. And as the learning partner, you can also help recognize when a student needs to pause or take a break or is distracted. Whether you're in a live session or you are just doing your work, the work that throughout the day, you can pause and take a break. Anytime you see your student is starting to feel a little bit anxious, is not quite able to stay on task, or even just needs to move around, taking a break is wonderful. Just let the teachers know, and we're happy to help with that. One last little tidbit I think that is interesting that has come up recently are blue light glasses. And I actually saw some for children at Walmart. They were like $1 or $2. And, they're just finding that blue light can be a little overwhelming on the eyes. And with having sensory needs, finding any way we can help that is wonderful. So if you have a student that might benefit from the blue light glasses, I did see him at Walmart for a couple dollars. And that's just another way to try to help avoid that overstimulation. That wraps up our sensory needs portion. Does anybody have any questions in regards to sensory needs or questions in general?
Okay. Well, thank you for that. That was a lot of good information that was shared today, especially with the sensory needs and taking breaks. And I learned about the to-do list. I did not realize that was in Google, so that was good information to know. If you have any questions, you feel free, you can bring them up now, or you can email us after the presentation is over, and we'll definitely get back with you. We have a quick survey for you to fill out just to give us some feedback on today's session, if you can complete that. Our next session is coming up next week. It's March 23rd at 1:30 p.m. and it is our federal programs review meeting that we have usually a couple of times a year for the parents. And we go over our federal programs. We ask for input so we can kind of start planning for the next school year. So we will go ahead and end the session for today if you do not have any questions. So thank you for joining us. And again, this meeting was recorded. So we will be posting it in Brightspace for those that were unable to attend. And if you want to go back and watch anything to get the information, we'll have it there for you as well. So thank you very much.